I am standing on the front porch of my father's house, the house where I grew up, the house where I learned to ride a bike in the driveway, the house where my father made green chili on Sunday mornings until the smell got into the walls and my key does not work. I try it again, same key I've had since I was 14 years old. The lock has been changed. My name is Nadia Reyes. I'm 36 years old. 3 weeks after my father's funeral, his wife of 4 years handed me a moving notice and told me I had 30 days to collect my belongings. Then she changed the locks before the 30 days were up. What she did not know, what she had apparently never bothered to find out, was that I had been listed on the deed to that house for 11 years. The night before I was supposed to leave, I found the original deed in my father's filing cabinet. And what I did next took 18 months and ended in a Maricopa County courtroom with Loretta Vigares signing her name to a document that removed her from the only thing she had come for. Before I tell you how we got there, subscribe, hit the bell, and tell us in comments from where are you watching this video, and let's go back to the beginning. You need to understand what that house actually was before you can understand what it meant to get it back. My father's name was Domingo Reyes, and he was not a complicated man. He liked his coffee black, his garden watered by 6 in the morning, and his Saturday afternoons entirely unscheduled. He drove the same truck for 17 years. He called me Mija until the day he died, even when I was 35 years old and standing a full inch taller than him in my work boots. He bought the house on Calle Serena in the Laveen neighborhood of Phoenix in 1994, the year I turned 8. I remember the day we moved in because my mother spent the whole morning crying. Not from sadness, she told me later, but from the specific relief of having a place that was entirely, legally, undeniably ours. My mother, Elena Reyes, had grown up in a house that belonged to her grandmother, then to an uncle, then to a cousin's husband, and she had watched her own mother pack boxes twice before she turned 12. When my father handed her the keys to the house on Calle Serena, she held them for a long time before she said anything. What she said was, "This is where we stay." The house was not large. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a kitchen that opened into a small dining area, and a backyard that my father immediately began treating as a personal project. Over the years, he put in a covered patio, a raised vegetable bed along the south wall, a fig tree that my mother chose, and a mesquite he planted from a seedling that was now, by the time this story takes place, taller than the roofline. The front yard had desert landscaping. My doing actually, when I was in college studying landscape architecture and needed a practice space. My father let me tear up the dead grass and replace it with decomposed granite, agave, and a pair of Palo Verde trees that bloomed yellow every spring. He told everyone who asked that his daughter had designed his yard. He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like, of course, his daughter had done this. What else would she have done? My mother died when I was 23. Ovarian cancer, caught late, moved fast. She was gone in 8 months from diagnosis to funeral, and my father was never quite the same person after. Not broken exactly, but quieter, more deliberate with his words. He kept watering the fig tree she had chosen every morning for years after she was gone, even during the summers when he had to drag the hose out before dawn to beat the heat. I moved back into the house on Calle Serena for 6 months after my mother died. I needed to be close to him, and honestly, he needed to not be alone. We fell into a routine. I made dinner on weeknights, he made breakfast on weekends. We watched baseball when it was on and old westerns when it wasn't. On Sunday mornings, he made green chili from his mother's recipe. From dried chilies he sourced from a specific produce market on 35th Avenue, and the smell of it would soak into every surface in that kitchen. I moved out eventually, into an apartment in Tempe, then into a rental house near my firm in Scottsdale, but I was back on Calle Serena every Sunday for the next 12 years. Every Sunday. I don't say that to make myself sound devoted. I say it because it matters to the story. Because when Loretta Vega later tried to describe me as an estranged daughter who had abandoned her father, there were 12 years of Sunday afternoons that said otherwise. My father's name was on the deed to that house from the day they bought it. My mother's name was on it too, and when she died, her half passed automatically to him. They had held it in joint tenancy with right of survivorship, which my mother had insisted on because she had watched too many families lose property to probate court after a spouse died. In 2012, my father added my name to the deed. He didn't make a big announcement about it. He mentioned it one Sunday over coffee, almost casually. "I went and added you to the deed last week, Mija, figured it made sense, and I didn't fully absorb what that meant at the time." I thanked him. I remember thinking I should look into it more carefully. I didn't. I trusted him. The deed went into his filing cabinet and stayed there for 11 years. I want you to hold onto that detail. Hold onto the filing cabinet. My father met Loretta Vega at a church function in the fall of 2018. He was 68 years old. She was 59. She had been widowed 3 years earlier, had one adult son named Christian who lived in Tucson, and she sang in the choir, which is how my father noticed her first. He told me she had a voice that sounded like something worth paying attention to. I met her in February of 2019, about 5 months into their relationship. My father brought her to Sunday lunch, and she arrived with homemade tamales wrapped in a dish towel and a warm, easy smile that I found immediately likable. She was organized and direct, and she laughed at my father's jokes, which were not always funny. She asked me questions about my work and listened to the answers. She called my father Domingo, which almost no one did. Most people called him Mingo, and something about the full name in her mouth sounded careful. Like she was being precise about him, like he mattered to her. I want to be honest about this part. I liked Loretta for a full year, maybe longer. She was good to my father in ways I could observe. She cooked for him, drove him to appointments, got him to a cardiologist for a heart check he had been putting off for 2 years. When he had a brief health scare in spring of 2020, a minor cardiac event, nothing requiring surgery but frightening, she was at the hospital before I was because she was closer. She called me from the waiting room, and her voice was steady and practical, and that steadiness mattered. They married in September of 2020. It was a small ceremony because of the pandemic, just family, outdoors, my father in a gayabera that he ironed himself. I was there. I hugged Loretta at the reception and meant it. Her son Christian came down from Tucson for the wedding. He was 34 at the time, broad-shouldered, with a habit of checking his phone mid-conversation that I tried not to find rude. He worked in commercial real estate property management, he said, though he was vague about the specifics. He shook my hand, called me Nadia, and made a joke about us being step-siblings that I laughed at because the alternative was awkward silence. I would spend the next 2 years telling myself that Christian was fine, that he was just a bit much, that the slightly proprietary way he walked through my father's house when he visited, opening the refrigerator, commenting on furniture, standing in the backyard and looking at it like he was estimating something, was just a personality quirk. A Tucson guy, real estate brain, couldn't help sizing things up. I was wrong about that, but I won't get ahead of myself. The first year of the marriage was unremarkable in the ways that matter to this story. My father seemed happy. Loretta was present and capable. The Sunday routine shifted slightly. Loretta joined us sometimes, was absent other times, and on the Sundays, she was there. The dynamic was slightly formal, the way it is when you're still working out how to share a space with someone new. I adjusted. My father was happy. That was what I was paying attention to. The second year was when things started to change. But they changed so slowly that I almost didn't feel it happening. That, I've come to understand, is exactly how it was designed to work. The first thing I noticed was the photographs. The house on Calle Serena had always had photographs on the walls, a mix of family portraits, candid shots, the kind of domestic visual history that accumulates over decades. There was a framed photo of my parents on their wedding day in the hallway. There was a school photo of me at about 10 years old, missing a front tooth, that my father had kept on his desk long past the point of embarrassment. There were photos of my mother's family in New Mexico, photos of my father's family in Sonora, photos from a trip my parents took to Oaxaca for their 25th anniversary. In the spring of 2022, I came for Sunday lunch and noticed the hallway wall was different. The wedding photo of my parents was gone. In its place was a framed photograph of my father and Loretta at the wedding, the September 2020 ceremony. It was a nice photo. I registered the change and said nothing because what would I have said? He was allowed to put up a photo of his current wife. The old photo was presumably just stored somewhere. 6 weeks later, the Oaxaca photo was gone too, and the photo of my mother's family. I still said nothing. I watched. The conversations began to shift as well. Loretta had opinions about the house, not dramatic ones, not delivered with any aggression, but opinions that surfaced regularly in ways that accumulated weight. The patio furniture was outdated. The guest room could use new paint. The raised bed in the backyard was taking up space that could be a seating area. She said these things in that careful, considered way she had, and my father would nod. And sometimes the thing would happen and sometimes it wouldn't, but the direction of movement was always the same, away from what was there before. By late 2022, I noticed that Loretta had started referring to the house as our home in a particular way, with a slight emphasis, a territorial specificity, as if she were staking something in the word. This is a subtle thing to describe. It's the kind of thing that sounds paranoid if you mention it to someone who hasn't lived it. She said our home, so what? It was a home she shared with her husband. Of course she said our home. But the emphasis was directed. It happened when I was present. It happened most pointedly on the occasions when I mentioned anything related to the property, asking about the fig tree, whether the irrigation was still running correctly, things that were, by any normal measure, just family conversation. Loretta would hear those questions, and within a few minutes, there would be a reference to our home, to our plans for the yard, to something that positioned me as a visitor and positioned her as a resident with future plans that I was not part of. I started keeping notes in early 2023. Just small things, dates, observations, what was said, by whom, in front of whom. I don't know what made me start doing this. I'm an organized person by profession. Landscape architecture requires documentation, site plans, recorded decisions. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe some part of me knew I was going to need a record. In March of 2023, Christian came down from Tucson for a long weekend. This was not unusual. He had been visiting more frequently since the wedding, maybe 3 or 4 times a year. What was different this time was that he spent part of Saturday morning with Loretta at the kitchen table. And when I arrived for Sunday lunch, the following day, I caught the end of a conversation that stopped when I walked in. Loretta straightened up. Christian put his phone face down on the table. "Nadia," Loretta said warmly immediately. Come in, come in. Mingo's just finishing up in the back." And she smiled at me and offered me coffee, and the moment passed like it had never happened. But I had seen the way Christian moved his phone, and I had seen the particular quality of that pause, and I wrote it down that evening. March 19, 2023. Christian and Loretta at kitchen table. Conversation stopped when I arrived. No explanation offered. Christian, phone face down. I didn't know what they were discussing. I wouldn't know for another 6 months. My father's health declined more seriously in the spring of 2023. It was nothing singular, a confluence of things that happen to men in their 70s who have had one cardiac event and perhaps have not been as rigorous about their follow-ups as their cardiologist would like. He was tired more often. He moved more slowly. He had a stubborn cough that turned out to be related to medication and took weeks to resolve. By July, he was getting around the house with a cane on bad days, which was more bad days than good. I was there more frequently, not just Sundays, but some Wednesdays, some Saturday mornings. I brought meals when Loretta asked me to, sat with my father in the backyard in the evenings when the heat broke, talked to him about everything and nothing. He was still himself, sharp-eyed, dry humor, always curious about my work, but he was slower, and we both knew what slow meant. It was during this period that Loretta began managing more of the household matters. She handled pharmacy pickups, scheduled appointments, dealt with insurance paperwork. My father handed these things over to her with the practicality of a man who knows his energy has to be rationed. I told myself this was appropriate. This was what a spouse was for. In September of 2023, my father had a fall. He was fine, a bruised hip, no fracture, but it shook him. He spent a week mostly in his bedroom recovering, and it was during this week that I first noticed the filing cabinet had been moved. It had always been in the small room off the kitchen that my father used as an office, a room that had been my bedroom when I was very young, before they converted the third bedroom for me when I was 5. The filing cabinet, a 2-drawer steel unit he'd had since before I was born, had always sat against the east wall of that room, next to his desk. After the fall, it was gone from that wall. When I asked my father about it, he waved his hand vaguely. Loretta reorganized. It's around somewhere in the distracted, tired way he dealt with domestic details that didn't interest him. I looked in the closet of that room. Not there. I didn't look harder at the time because it wasn't yet urgent. In November, my father had a second cardiac event. More serious this time. He was in the hospital for 4 days and came home with a revised medication protocol and instructions about activity that were, in a word, sobering. My father died in his sleep on February 14, 2024. He was 73 years old. There was no pain as far as anyone can tell. He had been tired the previous few days. The hospice nurse who had been coming in for the past 3 weeks told me afterwards that this was often how it went. At the end, a drawing in, a quietness, and then simply the absence. I held his hand at the funeral and thought about all the Sunday mornings I could not get back. I thought about green chili and the fig tree, and the way he said "Mija like it" was the simplest word in the world. 3 weeks later, Loretta handed me an envelope. Inside the envelope was a typed letter informing me that as the sole heir and owner of the property at Calle Serena, she was giving me 30 days to remove my personal belongings from the premises. I stood in my father's kitchen holding this letter, and I want to tell you exactly what I felt. Not rage, not even grief in that moment. I felt a kind of cold clarity. The kind that comes when something you suspected but couldn't prove becomes suddenly, irrefutably real. I asked Loretta if I could use the bathroom. She said of course. I walked down the hallway and instead of going to the bathroom, I went to the small office room. The filing cabinet was in the closet. Pushed to the back behind a box of Christian's things, his name was written on the box in black marker. I opened the top drawer. It was mostly empty, some old utility bills, a vehicle manual. I opened the bottom drawer. My hands were very steady, which surprised me. There, in a hanging folder labeled property, was my father's copy of the deed. I took the folder. I walked to the bathroom, stayed for a believable length of time, walked back to the kitchen, said goodbye to Loretta, and drove to my car. In the parking lot of a gas station 2 blocks away, I opened the folder. The deed was a standard Maricopa County warranty deed, executed in 2012. The grantees listed were Domingo Reyes and Nadia Reyes as joint tenants with right of survivorship. My name was on the deed. Had been on the deed for 11 years. Which meant that when my father died, his half had not passed to Loretta. It had passed to me. Which meant Loretta did not own the house on Calle Serena. I owned the house on Calle Serena. I sat in that parking lot for 23 minutes. I know because I looked at my phone when I arrived and again when I started the car. I didn't cry. I'm not sure what I did exactly, some state between shock and resolution, where your mind is running very fast but very quietly. Then I drove to the Maricopa County Recorder's office. I need to take you back before I take you forward, because the recorder's office visit is not the whole story. It is not even the most important part of the story. To understand what Loretta had been doing, and more specifically, what Christian had been helping her do, you need to understand what I found out over the next 3 months. I pulled the official deed record at the recorder's office that same afternoon. The 2012 deed was on file exactly as I had found it in the cabinet. Domingo Reyes and Nadia Reyes, joint tenants. But there was a second document filed, dated November 2023, 4 months before my father died. It was a quit-claim deed, purporting to transfer all interest in the property from Domingo Reyes to Domingo Reyes and Loretta Vega Reyes as community property. My name was not on this document. My interest was not mentioned. My father's signature appeared at the bottom. Here is what a quit-claim deed cannot do. It cannot transfer an interest that the grantor does not have. My father held a 50% interest in the property as a joint tenant with me. He could not have quit-claimed the entire property without my signature, and he had not attempted to get my signature. Here is what I did not yet know, whether my father had understood what he was signing, or whether he had signed it at all. I photographed both documents and drove home and called an attorney that same evening, a woman named Patricia Ackefer, a property and probate attorney I had met through a professional acquaintance 2 years earlier and had always kept in mind. I told her what I had. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, very calmly, "Don't move your things out of that house. And don't discuss this with Loretta or Christian yet." I said I understood. Then she said, "Do you have anything that shows your father's mental state in November of last year?" I thought about it, I said, his neighbors might. My father had lived on Calle Serena for 30 years. The neighborhood was the kind that still had people who had been there a long time. Not everyone. Phoenix neighborhoods turn over, but some. The Tafoya family 3 doors down had been there almost as long as my father. Their daughter Rosa, who was my age, had grown up alongside me and still lived 2 streets over and came to check on her parents regularly. The family directly next door was the Butlers, Jean and Helen Butler, both in their late 70s, retired teachers. Jean Butler had been my father's closest friend on the block for 15 years. They had watched football together, argued about landscaping decisions together, attended each other's family funerals. When my mother died, Jean Butler was at the house every day for a week. I called Jean Butler from the parking lot of a Walgreens 2 evenings after I found the deed. He picked up on the second ring and his voice went immediately warm and sad. "Nadia, sweetheart, we've been thinking about you." I asked him how my father had seemed last fall, in November specifically. Jean was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are you asking?" I told him, in brief, what I had found. Not everything, I didn't yet have the full shape of it, but enough. A document signed in November when my father was not well. Jean Butler was silent. For so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then he said, "Nadia, there was a man here in November. I didn't know who he was. He came twice that I saw. First time your father was outside and this man came to the door and your father let him in. Second time your father wasn't outside. Loretta let him in. Your father didn't come out. I thought it was a doctor, or insurance." He paused. "He had a briefcase," Jean said, "the kind with the metal latches." I wrote down everything he said. I asked if he would be willing to speak with an attorney. He said, "Whatever you need, sweetheart. Whatever you need." Helen Butler, it turned out, had also seen something. She had been in their front room in early November, she told me later, and had seen through the window as Loretta walked someone to their car, a tall man, younger, in a dark jacket. She had assumed it was a family member. She had not thought about it again until I called. I needed to know who that man was. Patricia Ackefer, my attorney, already had a theory. She requested the notarization records on the November quit-claim deed. The notary's name was Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb had a business address in Tucson, Arizona. Christian Vega lived in Tucson. The property management company Christian worked for, I found this after 2 hours on my laptop, had a business address that shared a suite number with a notary service called Webb & Associates. Let me tell you about Rosa Tafoya, because she matters. Rosa is 36 years old, same as me. We were in the same grade for most of elementary school, lost touch in high school the way you do, and reconnected in our 20s when we were both back visiting our parents on the same summer weekend, and ended up talking for 3 hours in the Tafoya driveway about our jobs, our lives, what the neighborhood had become. She's a social worker for Maricopa County, and she has the specific kind of emotional intelligence that her profession both selects for and sharpens. She notices things, remembers them accurately, and describes them without embellishment. Rosa had been to Calle Serena several times in the fall of 2023 to see her parents. She had waved at my father across the yard in October and stopped to talk to him for a few minutes over the fence. She told me when I asked that he had been warm and like himself in that conversation, asking about her kids, making a joke about the Diamondbacks. Clear, present. She had seen him again in late November from her parents' driveway, and something had been different. He looked thin, she told me. We were sitting in her car outside her parents' house, a gray Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after I found the deed. He was getting the mail and he looked thin and he was moving slow. I almost went over, but my mom called me in. I've been thinking about that since I heard he passed. I asked if she had seen any visitors to the house in November, any cars she didn't recognize. She looked at me for a moment. There was a silver SUV, she said. I noticed it because it parked in front of my parents' driveway, which, you know, my dad. He came out to say something about it, but by the time he got to the door, the guy was already going up your dad's front walk. I asked if she'd seen the man's face. He was younger, maybe early 40s, and he was carrying something, a bag or a case, I couldn't tell what. I showed her a photograph. Not a confrontational thing, I had simply found a professional headshot on the website of Christian Vega's property management company and pulled it up on my phone. Rosa looked at the photo. Her expression changed. That's him, she said. That's the man I saw. I said, would you be willing to put that in a signed statement? She said yes, without hesitating. She also said something, as I was getting out of her car, that I've thought about many times since. Nadia, your dad, he loved that house. He talked about it like it was a person, like it had a life. He would have known what he was signing. She paused. Which means either he didn't know what it was, she said, or he didn't sign it. I want to tell you about the last Sunday before my father died, because it has nothing to do with deeds or documents, and everything to do with why I fought as hard as I did. It was early February 4th, a Sunday, 10 days before he died. He was in his chair in the backyard, in the afternoon shade of the mesquite tree, and I had brought green chili from the market because he didn't have the energy to make it himself anymore, but had said he was craving it. I heated it on the stove and brought it out in a bowl the way his mother used to serve it, and he held the bowl in both hands and said, quietly, "This is pretty close." We sat out there for a long time without talking much. The fig tree his wife had chosen, my mother, his first wife, Elena, was just starting to come out of its winter dormancy, the small new leaves bright green against the gray bark. He watched it for a while. "You know what your mother said when we planted that?" he asked. I said I didn't. She said, "Domingo, a fig tree takes 3 years to produce fruit. Plant it anyway." He was quiet. I've been thinking about that a lot. She was right about most things. I asked him if he was okay. He turned and looked at me with that clear, direct look. He had the look that had never wavered, even when his body was slowing down, and said, "I am fine, Mija. I am right where I'm supposed to be." We stayed in the yard until the sun dropped behind the neighbor's roofline and the temperature came down, and I helped him back inside and made sure his medications were laid out correctly for the evening. Loretta was out. A choir rehearsal, she had said. We had those 2 hours entirely to ourselves. Before I left, he hugged me in the kitchen doorway and said, "You know this house is yours. You know that." I thought he was speaking emotionally, the way a father speaks when he's sentimental and tired. I said, "I know, Dad." I did not know then what he actually meant. 2 months into my investigation with Patricia Ackafer, we had assembled a picture that was both clearer and more complicated than I had initially understood. Here is what we believed had happened. At some point in late 2022 or early 2023, around the time of that conversation, I had interrupted at the kitchen table. With Christian's phone face down, Loretta and Christian had realized that my name was on the deed to the house. This would have been a significant obstacle to any plan involving the property. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship meant that if my father died, his interest would pass directly to me, not through probate, not to his spouse. The property would simply become mine. The quitclaim deed filed in November 2023 was an attempt to address this problem. If my father had quitclaimed his interest to himself and Loretta as community property, it would have severed the joint tenancy, meaning the right of survivorship would no longer apply. His half would then pass through the estate, which Loretta, as surviving spouse, could claim. There were 2 problems with this plan. First, my father could only convey the interest he had 50%. He could not convey my interest without my signature. The quitclaim deed could sever his joint tenancy, but it could not erase my underlying ownership of the other 50%. Second, we had significant questions about whether my father had understood or consented to the document he was purportedly signing. His health in November had been notably diminished. The presence of a notary connected to Christian's business, the secrecy of the visit, the timing, all of it was concerning. Patricia requested my father's medical records from October and November 2023. What they showed was consistent with what the Butlers and Rosa Tafoya had observed. A man who was physically declining, who had been prescribed new medications that included known cognitive side effects, and who had had 2 documented physician visits in October where his primary care doctor noted, in clinical language, that his cognitive processing was slower than baseline and he was easily fatigued. This was not a man who should have been signing property documents without family present. My father, we believed, may not have understood what he was signing, or he may have been shown the document in a way that misrepresented its contents. Or, and this was the possibility that was hardest to sit with, he may not have signed it at all. Patricia commissioned a handwriting analysis of the signature on the quitclaim deed, compared against authenticated samples of my father's signature from documents we could verify. His tax returns, his vehicle registration, a letter he had written to his church in September 2023. The analyst's finding was carefully worded, as these findings always are. She could not definitively conclude forgery, but she could conclude that several characteristics of the signature on the quitclaim deed were inconsistent with the authenticated samples, particularly the pressure variance and letter formation in his last name. It was not proof, but it was something. And then there was what Loretta did not know, that my father had a personal attorney, a man named David Cisneros who had handled my parents' estate planning years ago, and who my father had seen independently in January 2024, 6 weeks before his death, while Loretta was out of town visiting her sister. David Cisneros called me the week after I first spoke to Patricia. He had heard from mutual contacts that there was a dispute over the property. He said, "Your father came to see me in January. He was worried about the house. He said he had signed something and wasn't sure what it was and wanted to know if it could be undone." I had to ask him to repeat that. I had to sit down. He was going to contest it, David Cisneros told me. He just ran out of time. Patricia Ackafer filed a complaint in Maricopa County Superior Court in May 2024. The action challenged the validity of the November 2023 quitclaim deed on 3 grounds: undue influence, lack of capacity, and potential fraud. It sought to have the document declared void and to quiet title in my name as the surviving joint tenant. Loretta hired an attorney. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he was, by all appearances, an experienced property litigator who handled the case with a certain aggressive efficiency that I think he thought would intimidate a woman who had never been in a courtroom before. He was wrong about who he was dealing with. Not because I am unusually bold, I'm not particularly, but because I had spent 3 months methodically building a record that was harder to shake than anything he had expected to find. Here is what we had. The original 2012 deed, showing joint tenancy between my father and me. The November 2023 quit-claim deed with the disputed signature. The handwriting analysis report. Jean Butler's signed statement about the visitor with the briefcase. Helen Butler's signed statement about the man Loretta walked to the car. Rosa Tafoya's signed statement identifying Christian Vega from a photo. Business registration records connecting Christian's employer to the notary Marcus Webb. My father's medical records showing cognitive decline in October, November 2023. David Cisneros' testimony that my father had expressed doubt about what he had signed. 11 years of my name on the original deed. 12 years of documentation that I was a consistent, present part of my father's life. The documentation of my presence was something Patricia had specifically requested early in the process. I had text message archives going back 8 years. I had photos time-stamped to specific Sundays. I had receipts from the farmer's market near his house, where I shopped for ingredients before coming over. I had emails where I had coordinated repairs and maintenance on the property with contractors my father trusted. I had a photograph, dated 3 years earlier, of me kneeling next to the Palo Verde tree in the front yard, pointing out new growth to my father who was standing beside me grinning. That photograph had a geotag. Every Sunday, documented or not, had left traces. Gerald Marsh's strategy, as it emerged, was to argue that the joint tenancy had been severed by the quit-claim deed regardless of its other complications, and that even if the deed had issues, Loretta's claim as surviving spouse to my father's community property interest was valid. It was not a frivolous argument. There were legal questions here that were genuinely complex. But he also tried something else. In his initial filings, he included a characterization of me that described my relationship with my father as intermittent and primarily financial in nature, implying I had been in and out of his life and had had little genuine connection. When Patricia showed me that filing, I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, something more like, I have 12 years of receipts for green chili ingredients that prove otherwise. We spent 4 months in pre-trial proceedings. Discovery was extensive. Loretta and Christian both had to produce documents. The discovery process was where things got harder for their side. Christian's phone records showed contact with Marcus Webb in October 2023. 4 calls in the 2 weeks before the quit-claim deed was signed. He did not have a convincing explanation for these calls. Marcus Webb, when deposed, was careful and vague. He did not deny notarizing the document. He said he had been engaged to provide notary services and had observed the signature being placed on the document. When asked to describe the signatory's demeanor and comprehension, he said he had no concerns at the time. When asked whether he had conducted any capacity assessment or asked any questions to verify understanding, he said that was not standard notary procedure. He was not lying, technically, but the picture assembled from his testimony was of a notary who had been engaged to show up and stamp a document, not to verify that the man signing it knew what he was signing. Loretta, in her deposition, told a story in which my father had been fully informed and enthusiastic about the change, that it had been his idea, that he had wanted to ensure she was protected, that he had raised it himself. When asked why this had been done through Christian's professional contact rather than the family's existing attorney David Cisneros, she said she did not know who Christian had used and had left the arrangements to him. Then Patricia asked her, "When did you first learn that Nadia Reyes was listed on the deed to the property?" Loretta hesitated. "I always knew," she said. "Always?" Patricia asked. "Since I learned about the property." "When was that?" Another pause, shortly after the wedding. "And did you tell Nadia?" "It wasn't my place to tell her." "Did you tell your son Christian?" The pause before this answer was 3 full seconds. I counted. "We may have discussed the property," Loretta said, "generally." There was a moment in Loretta's deposition that I want to describe carefully, because it is the moment that the shape of everything became fully clear to me. Patricia was taking her through the events of November 2023, specifically the visits Jean Butler had witnessed. Loretta had maintained throughout the deposition that any document signing had been straightforward and voluntary. She had been consistent, composed, and careful, not robotic, but practiced. Then Patricia placed a photograph on the table. It was a photograph my father had taken. I had found it on an old digital camera he kept in a desk drawer when I was going through his things. It was dated November 8, 2023, the approximate date of the second visit Jean Butler had witnessed. My father had taken it in the backyard. It showed the mesquite tree and the fig tree and the covered patio, and in the background, through the sliding glass door, the shadow of someone sitting at the kitchen table. My father had taken a photograph of his own yard that day. The way he always did. The way he documented the things he loved. And whatever had been happening inside the house had not stopped him from going into the yard and taking a photograph of the trees. Patricia placed the photo in front of Loretta and asked a very simple question. "Who is sitting at that kitchen table?" Loretta looked at the photograph. She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she said. "You don't recognize the person?" "No." Patricia put a second photograph next to it, a screen grab from Christian's own Instagram page, from a post from the previous year, showing Christian at a restaurant clearly visible, the kind of photo where you can see his face, his height, the jacket he was wearing. "Does this person look familiar?" Patricia asked. "That's my son," Loretta said. "Is that the same person at your kitchen table on November 8, 2023? The deposition record shows a 6-second pause here. "I would need to look more carefully," Loretta said. We looked more carefully. We brought in an imaging analyst. She confirmed that the figure visible through the glass was consistent in height and build with Christian Vega, and that the jacket visible was consistent with a jacket photographed on Christian's social media in the same period. Christian's deposition was held separately. He maintained that any visits to the house in November had been personal, family visits, seeing his mother and stepfather. When pressed on his professional connection to Marcus Webb, he said they were acquaintances. When asked why he had called Webb 4 times in October, he said he couldn't recall the specific calls. When Patricia asked him whether he had been present at the house on November 8, 2023, he said he couldn't be certain. When she showed him the photograph his stepfather had taken of the backyard, Christian looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "My mother asked me to come help with some paperwork." His attorney immediately put his hand on Christian's arm, but the answer was in the record. The trial took place over 3 days in March 2025. I won't take you through it moment by moment, because courtrooms are not like television. They are long, procedurally careful, and the moments of clarity are distributed across a great deal of waiting. What I will tell you is this. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Patricia Delgado Chen, who had been on the Maricopa County bench for 11 years, and who conducted the proceedings with a thoroughness that I found both exhausting and, ultimately, reassuring. She asked questions. She read documents carefully. She was not impressed by either side's attorneys in any theatrical sense. She was interested in facts, in records, in what could be demonstrated. The case turned, ultimately, on 2 things. First, the handwriting analysis, combined with the medical records. combined with David Cisneros' testimony about my father's state of mind in January 2024, taken together, this body of evidence was sufficient for Judge Delgado Chen to find that the November 2023 quitclaim deed had not been executed with the free and voluntary consent of a person with the legal capacity to execute it. She found, specifically, that there was clear and convincing evidence of undue influence, and that the document was void. Second, the 2012 deed, which had been valid, which had placed my name on the property as a joint tenant with right of survivorship, which had never been validly severed, which meant that when my father died, his half of the property passed to me. Judge Delgado Chen issued a ruling quieting title to the house on Calle Serena entirely in my name. Not 50%, 100%, because the joint tenancy had never been validly severed and my father's interest had passed to me by operation of law. Loretta's attorney asked for a stay. It was denied. I was sitting at the plaintiff's table when the ruling was read, and I want to tell you honestly that I did not feel triumphant. I felt exhausted and sad, and something that is hard to name, the particular grief of having been right about something you wished you had been wrong about. I thought about my father taking a photograph of his backyard on November 8, 2023. I thought about the fig tree. I thought he knew this house was mine. He said so. He just ran out of time to finish saying it. Loretta Vigares had to vacate the house on Calle Serena within 60 days of the ruling. She did not contest this in any further legal action, which suggested to me, and to Patricia, that she and Christian had reached the conclusion that further proceedings carried risks for Christian that were not worth the exposure. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office received a referral from Judge Delgado Chen's ruling, which had made certain findings that fell within the purview of elder abuse statutes. I don't know, as of this recording, what has come of that referral. These things move slowly, and I have chosen not to hold my breath. What I know is what Loretta lost. She lost the house. She lost the 4 years of effort and planning that had gone into what she and Christian had believed was a clean arrangement. She lost, and I think this may have been harder than the house, the ability to tell the story she had wanted to tell, the devoted second wife who had cared for a man in his decline and been left his home. That story was not available to her anymore. The record of the case was public. I have not spoken to Loretta since the ruling. I do not plan to. Christian faced professional consequences I was not directly involved in. His employer was a licensed property management company in Arizona, and licensed companies operate under certain regulatory obligations. That is all I will say about that. Gene Butler called me the day I told him about the ruling. He was very quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your dad would be real pleased." And then I did cry, finally, in the parking lot of a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. Not because I had one, but because Gene Butler knew my father and he said would be, and that meant my father was not here to be pleased, and that was the loss that the house could not fix. Helen Butler brought a casserole to the house the following week. She has a key now. The neighbors have always had a key. I moved back into the house on Calle Serena in June 2025. I want to be honest about what that was like. It was strange. The house was both entirely familiar and subtly wrong in ways that took time to identify and address. Loretta had repainted 2 rooms. The hallway photographs were different from what I remembered. There were none of my mother, none of the family trips, none of the New Mexico family. I found some of the original photographs in a box in the garage. I rehung the wedding photo of my parents. I found the 10-year-old school photo of me, the one with the missing tooth, in a box of things Loretta had apparently sorted to donate. I put it back on my father's desk. The fig tree my mother had chosen was not in great shape. It had not been properly maintained in the 1.5 years since my father died. I pruned it back carefully and put it on a watering schedule. It will be fine. Fig trees are harder to kill than they look. The mesquite my father had grown from a seedling was perfect, because nothing can kill a mesquite once it's established. I sat under it the first evening I was back, in the heat of early summer, and I did not make green chili because I am not sure I am ready to do that yet. But I made coffee and sat outside until the sky went dark, and the neighborhood sounds settled into their familiar patterns: dogs, distant traffic, someone's sprinklers on a timer. And I thought about what it meant to be right where you're supposed to be. I am a landscape architect. I have spent my career understanding that places take time to establish, that root systems grow in ways you cannot see, that the most important work happens underground, in the years before anything is visible. My father planted a mesquite tree in 1997. He could not have known then that I would sit under it in 2025. He planted it anyway. I'm going to stay. If you're still with me, thank you. This story took 18 months to live through and much longer to understand, and I'm not sure I understand all of it yet. Here is what I know. Property documents are public record in most counties and states. The Maricopa County Recorder's website is searchable by name or address. If you are the child of an aging parent who owns property, and you are not certain whose names are on that deed, it is worth an afternoon of your time to find out. Not because you should be suspicious of everyone, but because the people who intend harm rely on you not knowing what you have. If your name is on a deed in joint tenancy, that interest cannot be transferred without your signature. If a document appears that tries to convey it anyway, that document has a problem. And if you are sitting with a parent who is getting older, and they say something that sounds like they're speaking emotionally, you know this house is yours, you know that, listen carefully. They may be telling you something very specific. If any part of this story sounds like something in your own life, if you've been pushed out of a place that was supposed to be yours, or if you're watching something happen to someone you love and you don't quite have the words for what it is, leave a comment. I read them. And every story I hear convinces me more that the people who do this rely on silence. Don't be silent. Hit subscribe if you're new. There are more stories. I'll see you in the next one.